So this evening it's my pleasure to welcome Professor McNamara, an emeritus professor of Bristol University and a specialist in animal behavior and the mathematical treatment of it. This is something that is science, but it's also highly relevant to philosophy and to understanding the human condition. Of course, humans are not so easy to analyze because we build on top of our instinctive values, we erect cultures which differ from one society to another. But for some of the more analytical aspects of it, Professor McNamara.
Well, thank you for inviting me. So, if you look about you, I've got to get this thing to work. Hold on. Right, good-o. If you look about you in the natural world, you see organisms performing diverse and quite often rather bizarre activities. So, I mean, birds sing, they display, fish, they shoal, they change sex, bees dance, spiders make webs, etc., etc. So it's quite natural to ask, why do they do this? So I'm concerned with this particular question. What my role here is actually not to explain any of these phenomena in detail, because that would require a lot of work. I'm not an expert in, for example, why bees dance. What I want to explain is how a mathematical modeler like me might approach questions of this sort. So it's about modeling, it's about how science is done. That's really what my talk is about. Okay. The first thing, before I get on to the models, is I need to be rather clear about what I mean by the term why. So let's concentrate on a particular example. Why do voles avoid hawks? So here's a vole, and it's feeding quite happily out. There's some food away from that tree, and then a hawk turns up, and the vole scurries back under the cover of the tree. Why is it doing this? Now, at one level, you can say, well, the vole is afraid of the hawk, and that's true, but that's what one would call a mechanistic explanation. But you could then ask, why does the vole have this mechanism? And that's a rather different question. And what one would be then seeking is an ultimate or functional explanation. And at least my explanation was that fear of hawks is adaptive in the sense that it increases the vole fitness. Voles which are not scared of hawks don't leave many offspring. Okay. So I'm thinking in terms of avoidance of hawks as a behavior which has evolved under the action of natural selection. Okay. And it's this second question I'm interested in here, this second why question. So think about modeling adaptation. If you're thinking what will evolve in a particular environment, then you're talking about evolution, and evolution involves genes. But the trouble with genes is we have very little idea what genes control. For example, when birds sing, in fact, very little, almost no idea at all, and it's going to be very complicated. There are going to be many genes which interact, etc. And so what one tends to do is to take a shortcut, which has turned out to be very productive. It isn't always going to be true, but this shortcut is called the phenotypic gambit. And so what you assume is that whatever genes you've got, the action of natural selection can produce a population where the strategies adopted by population members have high fitness. Okay. So that's called the phenotypic gambit. And if you assume that, then a mathematical modeler like me, and then of course we can see what this behavior is, and we can compare it with observations and things like that. So, for a mathematical modeler like me, The formal approach is as following. We specify the situation you're concerned with, specify what actions the animal can perform, what are the consequences. You'll see this in operation in a few minutes. What strategies you're thinking in terms of. Strategies are behavioral rules, and they could be very flexible things, like feed out here if there's no hawk, and run away if there is a hawk. Specify an appropriate measure of fitness. Now, fitness is an overused word, even in biology, and is used very imprecisely. For the moment, just think of it as the fitness of an organism is the average number of offspring left by that organism over its lifetime, numbers of surviving offspring. It turns out that this is not an adequate measure of fitness in some circumstances. And I can come back to that at the end if people want me to elaborate. But for the moment, just think of it in those terms. And then, having done that, you use some mathematical optimization technique to find the strategy which maximizes your fitness measure. So you end up with this strategy, the maximizing strategy. And then you use that to make predictions about what animals do, and then that motivates empirical work. Often, actually, once people start doing empirical work, you find that some of your assumptions might not be right, or some of the conclusions, or it might highlight something important you've missed out in your model. And so you often refine models and things. Okay. So there's this feedback between modeling and theory. But the important thing, at least of the sorts of models that I make, is that the models expose why animals are doing it. And that's what interests me most. It's not just making predictions, it's understanding what forces have led to that prediction. What assumptions lead to this prediction as opposed to that prediction? What sort of environment do you expect to get this behavior as opposed to that behavior? Right, I'd better take this off. I'm too hot anyway, and it says expose the logic. That's what I do. Okay, so the outline of the talk. First of all, arguments in terms of adaptation have a long history. They were given, of course, even before Darwin, even before people had thought of natural selection. But most of those arguments were verbal until around about 50 years ago, when people started to make quantitative and mathematical models in various areas. And the three of the main areas are highlighted here, and what I will do in this talk is briefly describe these three areas. So that will be the first part of the talk. Then, I want to consider a particular problem, the dawn chorus in birds. So why is it birds sing at dawn rather than other times of day? And this model will involve the strategic regulation of energy reserves of this small bird I'm thinking of. I won't, by the way, I won't answer the question. It's too complicated. What I will expose is certain factors which have motivated experiments which have given us more information and a better understanding. And that's how science proceeds, and that's one of the things I want to convey here. That science doesn't tend to have eureka moments. You just do careful experiments, you get hypotheses, you test them, you refine them, and so on. And then finally, I will go on to talk about the situation when individuals interact with one another. And then we use what's called evolutionary game theory, and I will illustrate it with the conflict of interest between parents over care of their common young. And what I want to convey in that is that when there is this interaction, the flavor of, if you like, the logic is very different. So that will just be something right at the tail end of this talk. Okay. So, areas of quantitative modeling. I listed three of them. The first one, very simple, foraging theory. Animals need to get food. So what strategies do you expect them to have? You might think, for example, here's some small bird foraging. There are patches of food. Very, very simply, it exploits a patch. As it feeds on it, the food depletes. It depletes the patch, and eventually it's not profitable, if you like, for it to stay there, and you expect it to move to another patch. Okay. The question is, what sorts of behaviour do we expect there? Can you make predictions about when they should leave or stay further? The problem is relatively simple, but there are some hitches to it. And the hitches are this, that if you think of a bird on a patch, and should it stay longer, now the food is depleting, or should it leave? Well, it depends what it gets on other patches. What else is out there in the environment? Okay. Now, how much it's getting out there in the environment also depends on what it will do out there. So if you're asking what's the best thing for it to do on the current patch, it's tied up with what it will do on other patches. So you have to take, if you like, a more holistic approach to thinking about this. It's not just a single patch in isolation. Okay. And that's a feature of lots of the things I'll talk about today. Okay. Yes, another thing to say is that here I'm talking about a bird's behaviour, and I'm using a mathematical model to find what is the best thing to do with the bird. I'm in no way suggesting the bird itself is going through this process, but the bird has some sort of fairly simple rule which implements a strategy which performs well in their natural environment. So, for example, one strategy they could use which actually turns out to be homes in on an optimal strategy, is to take the food and some estimate of how much food there has been in the past on a patch, food per unit time, and to leave the current patch when the return rate on that patch drops to your current estimate. And if it keeps updating in that way, it'll do very well. Okay. Life history theory, this second area where there was this growth of models 50 years ago, is to do with the scheduling activities over the lifetime of an organism. So if you think of different organisms, humans typically essentially grow to adult size before reproducing, but a tree doesn't do that. A tree continues to grow often throughout its life, or a fish. Fish typically get bigger and bigger. The female fish, for example, and the bigger they are, the more offspring they produce. So they're growing all the time and reproducing. Some organisms reproduce once and then die, like Pacific salmon. Some reproduce many times over their lifetime, like humans and trees, most trees. Okay. So there are all these different lifestyles of organisms, and this area, life history theory, is concerned with trying to understand how each of these different lifestyles have evolved. So let me give you a particular illustration with the fish. A classic question might be, here we have a fish, a female fish. It gets resources from food. Should it put its resources into producing offspring now, or should it put its resources into growth? And growth means it will be bigger, and being bigger means it can produce more offspring in the future. Okay. Another example, I haven't worked on that particular example. One I have worked on is one in birds, where these birds are migrating birds, and how should they schedule their activities over the annual cycle? A bird has to molt at some stage, reproduce. These are migrating birds, so it has to migrate and decide how far to migrate and so on. And how should it schedule these things over the cycle? And that's quite a complicated problem, because what it does now affects how it is in the future. So a classic one is the knot, which is a long-distance migrant bird, where one of the adaptations to long-distance flight is to basically reduce its digestive system, in particular the gizzard. And so when it gets to its destination, it can't eat hard-shelled food very easily and has to regrow the gizzard. So there are all these things. What it does now affects other points in the cycle, if you like. So again, you get a situation where you cannot treat things in isolation. There's a sequence of interrelated actions. Okay. The third area is evolutionary game theory. So it's often the case, in fact it's probably almost always the case, that actions maximizing, if you like, how one individual in a population does depends on what other members of the same population are doing, because there's usually competition, etc., going on within the population. So how does one handle that? And let me give you some examples of this. If you take male salmon, then in coho salmon, for example, the males can come back in two forms. They can come back as hooks, and hooks are big fish, good at fighting, or they can come back as jacks, which are small fish. And the hooks come back, and they make a nest in the stream bed, and they entice females there. The females lay their eggs into the water. It's external fertilization in fish. And then the male can ejaculate his sperm into the water, which will fertilize the female's eggs. All well and good, except these jack males are sneakers. And what they do, they hover around the nest, and when the female produces her eggs, they whip into the nest, distribute sperm, and get the hell out of there before the resident male can attack them. So these two strategies, if you like, of reproduction. And you can see this might be the best thing to do in a population, depends on what others are doing. If there are lots of sneakers, these jacks, then they're probably competing with each other, and it's probably best to hold a territory. Whereas if everybody's holding a territory and you're a sneaker, you can probably get lots of matings. Give you another example. This is a very classic example which Darwin was interested in. The sex ratio of offspring. Many species can control whether they produce male or female offspring. So if you've got a female, should she produce a son or a daughter? Well, it depends what other population members are doing. If most of the population are producing daughters, it's best to produce sons because they can get lots of matings. But if most are producing sons, the males in the population will all be in competition with each other, and it's best then to produce a daughter, because the daughter will certainly be able to get fertilized. So there's an example where the best thing to do depends on what others in the population are doing. And I will come back to this example in a very sort of toy model later, but parental effort, the best effort of two parents caring for their common young, the best effort of one parent depends on what the other parent is doing. Okay. So, there are parallels, by the way, with economic game theory in this. Because in economic game theory, you have competitions there. It's not between animals, but between firms over production and so on. Okay. Very similar problem there. And the mathematics is very similar. Right, so I'm a modeler, but there are many sorts of models. And the sort of model I make is not of this sort. You might, for example, be making a climate change model. If you're making a climate change model, you want precise predictions. There are many factors which go into this model, and you include as many as you can, and you're trying to make a prediction. What will temperature rise within the next 10 years or something be? Okay. This is not the sort of model I make. Okay. So, the sorts of models I make are about understanding key assumptions and how they affect predictions. So, exposing the logic. And that's very good because making these formal models is a really good in terms of making you be explicit about all your assumptions and spelling them out, and to understand what it is you really are assuming. And also, hopefully, They suggest measurements and experiments. There's a phrase which may or may not be due to Einstein, which says models should be as simple as possible, but no simpler. Of course, you could put a lot of meanings on that, but what it means is you need to include enough in the model to capture the essence of what you're trying to get at. But if you make it too simple, it's worthless. So modeling is an art, in a way. It's an art of understanding your system well enough to know what to include and what not to include, and to understand how leaving one factor out might affect the conclusions you make. So I want to say that all models are limited. They're cartoons of the world. You need to understand what they can tell you, and you need to understand their limitations. So I'll come back to that. Okay, so let's look in more detail at one specific case, and this is the daily routine of singing of a male bird. So these are just two sort of random birds pulled from the literature. European wren. The arrows, by the way, represent dawn and dusk here on the time of day axis. You can see that the European wren has a peak of song around dusk or just before dusk, and then there's a dip during the day and another peak around dusk. Similarly with the red jungle fowl, quite a lot of singing before dawn, but again a peak at dusk. Now these different species have different routines, and also routines vary with the season as well. So the thing is actually quite complicated. But this is, if you like, rather typical. So if you were to look at that, the first thing to ask yourself is, why are these males singing at all? And so certainly they sing for various reasons, but it seems that two of the main reasons are to attract a mate, is the first thing, and for territorial defense. Territorial defense, you're telling other males, I'm here, I'm warning you, I'm here, I'm on this territory. Or they're defending a female. Now, again, as a modeler, there are all these things, but I don't want to put them all together in one model, because that will make things complicated. And I won't understand the why of the answer I get out. So I'm going to start off something very simple, which is just consider the case where a male at the beginning of the breeding season is singing to attract a mate. Okay. But why are they singing at dawn rather than other times of day? Okay. So when I first started to get into mathematical modeling in the 1980s, people were interested in this particular question, but all their answers were, if you like, what I call a local answer. So, for example, people said they're singing at dawn because light levels are low and foraging wouldn't be very profitable, therefore it's a good time to sing. Maybe acoustics are better at dawn because there's less turbulence in the air and the temperature is lower, so song carries better. Maybe there are more females at dawn, because males have died overnight or whatever. Anyway, there are all these explanations, there are yet more of these, but the problem with these, to me, I didn't find this very satisfactory, because what one was doing was considering dawn in isolation, whereas the bird had, if you like, a 24-hour routine where it had to fit in all its activities, such as feeding and sleeping and so on. So what one needed is a much more holistic approach. And I want to show you, if you like, a very simple model. Okay. So what I'm interested here in particular, what is missing, is strategic regulation of energy reserves. Now, for a small bird, if it doesn't get food, it lives in an environment where food is uncertain. And if it doesn't get food, any food at all, within a 24-hour period, it's likely to die of starvation. So it's really quite critical, getting food. Okay. And singing depletes the reserves of a bird, and typically they can't sing and forage at the same time. You might expect behavior to depend on reserves. You might expect a bird which has high energy reserves to sing and low reserves to forage. And so you expect some sort of trade-off between starvation risk and the benefits of song. This male is singing to attract a mate. The more it sings, the more likely it is to get a mate, but the less it forages, and therefore the more likely it is to starve. Okay. So that's the particular situation I'm going to look at. And I'm going to focus on a temperate latitude male bird singing to attract a mate, as I said. I want to build the simplest model that captures the biology and the reserves, expose the logic, but then it will be a limited model. All models are limited. In fact, I love this quote by George Box: all models are wrong, and they are, but some are useful. Okay, right. Okay, so this is a very old work. I'm going to look at a breeding season where the male is trying to attract a female over a period which of capital T days, there are day-night cycles. I'm going to assume, and this isn't true, that at night the bird must rest. I don't allow singing at night. Later models we allowed that. And in the daytime, they choose when to forage and when to sing. Okay. And we'll assume that energy reserves decrease unless the bird finds food. So our daytime decisions, what I did in the original model was divide the day into 75 different time intervals, where each of them they can decide to forage or sing. Now, why 75? Well, it's arbitrary. This is the thing about models. When you make a model, you have to specify all the detail. And then you have to ask, what difference does it make, this detail? So I put 75 in here. If you put 150 in, actually you get essentially the same answer. But you need to check that, because, okay. Now, each time of day of this decision epoch, you can either sing, and if it sings, it might get a mate. Or it can forage, but forage is uncertain, so it might get food. Now, those local explanations I gave said that foraging was better at certain times of day than others. What I want to do is to follow the logic of assuming that actually during the daylight period, nothing changes. These probabilities of getting a mate don't change with time of day, nor the probability of getting food changes with time of day. I want to see what comes out of my model, whether they forage evenly and sing evenly over the day or not. Okay. So. Importantly, and it is an important ingredient of the model, there are stochastic changes in energy reserve. There's randomness going on. Because there's good and bad luck in feeding, okay? But also because overnight temperature is very crucial to how much energy a small bird loses overnight. And that varies. Okay. So, I talked about fitness. I need some sort of performance measure from this bird, measuring how well it's doing. So, typically in these models, you model it with what's called reproductive value. The reproductive value is a very simple measure. It's the expected future number of offspring produced over the lifetime of the individual. Okay. So, here's our day-night cycle, if the bird reserves reach zero, it will starve. So if it starves, it won't produce any future offspring. So the reward, if you like, for starving is zero. Okay. If it survives my breeding window, but has no mate, then typically it may be able to find a mate later on, maybe next year or something of the sort. So it will be greater than zero. Okay? If it survives and has a mate, then it'll produce offspring this year, and possibly next year and so on, so its reward will be bigger still. Now again, you have to put numbers in for these two things, and again you need to worry about, does it make a difference what numbers you put in? And again, the answer is largely no. So a lot of modelling is about testing the specific assumptions to see how crucial they are for things. Okay. Right. So, how does one find the best thing for this bird to do? Well, again, we're in a situation where the best action for the bird to take now, in terms of, let's say, should it forage, depends on its likelihood of food in the future. But its likelihood in the food in the future depends on how much it's going to sing and forage in the future. So you can't, again, determine the best thing to do now until you know what it will do in the next hour or the next day. Okay. So, future behaviour. You have to take, again, a holistic view. If you knew what was best in the future, you could work out the best thing to do now. So the obvious logical thing to do is to work backwards from final time at the end of the breeding season. Work out the best thing to do in the last decision of the breeding season. If you know that, you can work out what to do in the penultimate decision and the one before it and so on. And this process of working backwards is called dynamic programming. And that's what I've used here. It's a very simple, it is mathematical, but it's a very simple sort of bookkeeping thing. Okay. Incidentally, you're making these models, they're complicated enough so that I can't write down the answer that comes out with a pencil and paper, and do a bit of maths and it'll come out. You have to compute them. Okay. It's just too messy. Okay, so this is for one particular parameter setting. This is a typical strategy coming out of the bird. So we're forcing it to rest overnight. This is a 24-hour period, dawn, dusk, following dawn. During the day, light period, it can sing or forage, and this is level of reserve here. And what you get is there's a critical level of reserve above which it should sing and below which it should forage. Okay. And this critical level is flat, if you like, constant during the early part of the day, and then rises up towards dusk. And it rises up towards dusk for obvious reasons. This bird it can't feed during the night. It's going to lose reserves overnight. It's got to build up its reserves so it doesn't starve overnight. Now, so a bird, following this strategy, let's say this is its reserves at dawn, it'll sing until its reserves hit here, it'll then forage and its reserves will keep going down until it finds a food item. And when it finds a food item, its reserves will jump up, and then it'll sing a bit more. And again, then forage. And that will go on throughout the day until our bird sings until dusk, and then rests until the following dawn again. Okay. So that's, if you like, a typical realization in this stochastic environment. Right. So, if you take a flock of birds following this strategy, what routine do you get out of it? Well, here's the routine you got out of this particular situation. You actually get a dawn chorus and a dusk chorus. And we need to understand why. Well, the first thing is, why do you get a dawn chorus? The reason is that the temperature overnight is uncertain, so the energy loss overnight is uncertain. So the bird has to give itself an insurance by building up sufficient reserves by dusk to survive a cold night. And that means on a night which isn't cold, it will have excess reserves at dawn, and you get a burst of singing. Okay. And you can, the thing about models, you think that's why it's happened. Let's change the parameters of the model and see if that makes sense. So you can interrogate your model. So what I've done here is I've actually, the frequency of cold nights is the same, but when there is a cold night, it's colder, so the bird leaves more energy. So what happens then? I get a bigger dawn chorus, because what's happened now is birds have had to put up their energy reserves even higher at dusk, so when it's not a cold night, they have more energy to sing, and you get a bigger dawn chorus. Okay. So, variation, unpredictability in energy reserves overnight produce the dawn chorus here. The dusk chorus. Well, the dusk chorus is actually very simple. There's uncertainty in foraging. So the bird builds up its reserves here, but it builds them up in advance of dusk. It can't leave it to the last minute because it might not find the food. So it has to do it early. And then typically, at the end of the day, on most days, they've managed to get the reserves they need overnight. And so they sing. It's as simple as that. Okay. So, this is a model where everything is constant during the daylight period, but you get a dawn and dusk chorus. Now, my purpose in doing this was, there are various purposes, but one of them is to get biologists to think in more holistic terms about this scheduling activity over the day. It's not necessarily that you can consider one time of day in isolation. You have to consider the whole routine in a holistic manner, and then you can get these things. Okay. The model did motivate people to go and look at certain things. For example, there were supplementary feeding experiments, and it's clear if you give them free food, they sing more. It's simple. It's very simple. Overnight temperature. There's certainly evidence that overnight temperature is important, and there's a correlation between how much they sing at dawn and the overnight temperature. When the temperature is high, they sing more at dawn. Okay. Rob Thomas did a nice experiment where during the day, he actually gave experimental birds different food supplies, some of which are more variable than others. And when he gave them a very variable food supply, he found they sang more at dusk, as one would predict. If they know they can build up reserves from dusk, they leave it to the last minute. If they don't, they build up early, and then they sing. Okay. So what have we learned from this model? Well, there's certainly a trade-off between singing and foraging is important for birds. The empirical stuff has shown this. And you know, the good thing about the model, it made people look at this. But the current model has lots of limitations. All models have limitations. For example, birds can, to some extent, predict when the night will be cold and change their behavior accordingly, and that isn't in the model. They can partly compensate for cold by going into torpor. There are more trade-offs there. Why don't they always go into torpor? Well, because there's probably predation risk associated with going into torpor. There's no predation risk in this model, incidentally, and it's probably an important factor. Now, what I'm not saying is these initial explanations that people give, that dawn is a good time to sing because they can't see very well and therefore foraging is poor, I'm not saying that's wrong. It's yet another factor. And in fact, in the real world, there is both a strategic regulation of energy reserves and a lot of other factors going on. And even now, this is 30 more years later, I don't think people have a comprehensive understanding of singing, in the daily routine of singing in birds. And it's because there are so many factors. It's because they sing for different reasons at different times during the season. Some of it's for territorial defense, as I said, sometimes to protect their females, sometimes to try and attract a female. There are all these other factors which are like predation and so on. And so different species all have different routines, and I don't work in this area anymore, but somebody needs to really get this all together and to really understand how all these factors influence it. But we don't have that yet, and we don't have a definitive explanation of why one species has this particular routine and another species has a different routine. Okay. So, models help expose the logic, motivate experiments, understand effects, but they're limited. And that's one of the things I wanted to show you. This is, if you like, how I think of science progressing. It's not big eureka moments or anything like that. It's just you generate hypotheses, people go out and they do careful experiments of things. And you update your knowledge a bit, and then that generates more models and more observations and so on. Okay. Right. So, let me move on. What I want to show you now is when the fitness of an individual depends on what others do, it can completely alter, if you like, the logic of what's going on. And this is just a fun example. It's, I should say when there are frequency-dependent effects, that is, the best thing to do depends on what others are doing. Fitness is not defined in absolute terms because fitness depends on what others in the population are doing. If you like, fitness is a peak somewhere, but the peak moves with the population. So again, doing genetics becomes even more difficult. And again, the shortcut that people use is to look for what is called an evolutionary stable strategy. That is a strategy which, if almost all population members adopt it, then no mutant individual can do better by adopting a different strategy. Okay. And if you formally analyze it, this endpoint of this is equivalent to, mathematically, the concept of a Nash equilibrium in economic game theory. Because Nash's concept there is, it's a, if you like, a strategy for a firm, which if all the firms adopt it, then no firm can do better by adopting a different strategy. Okay. My example is very loosely based on the penduline tit. It's an interesting bird because in the penduline tit, the female lays her eggs, and then one of the parents deserts. It's either the male or the female. Sometimes it's both, actually. But then there's never biparental care in this particular bird. And it appears that probably the male looks for opportunities to get other mates and will typically desert first if he can. But the female tries to prevent this by hiding the fact she's actually laid the eggs in the nest. Okay. And if she can lay the eggs and desert, the male is left with them. And that's what she wants. Okay. So there's conflict of interest between these two parents. Okay. So the model I'm going to present is loosely based on that, but the purpose is just a fun model which exposes the logic of why, when you've got these sorts of effects, models have a different flavor. So, female and male with common young, each decides whether to care or desert. Care is costly, and there's a conflict of interest. Each would prefer the other to pay the cost of doing the care, so they can go off and either rest or find some other partner. In my model, the male's going to choose first, and then the female's going to decide whether to desert based on the male's decision. Okay. So this is a decision tree. So the male decides, and he can either care or desert. If the male cares, the female can either care or desert. And similarly, if the male decides, female can care and desert. And these numbers here are these reproductive values. They're not empirically based. They're just pulled out of a hat to, if you like, to illustrate a logic. Okay. So the first number here is the numbers of future offspring to the male, and the second one is to the female here. So if the male cares and the female deserts, the male has 3 offspring in the future, including the current ones, but the female who deserts has 7 because she can go out and do something else. Okay. So what's the logic here? Well, supposing the male cares. If the male cares, the female can either care or desert. If she cares, she'll get 6 future offspring. If she deserts, she'll get 7. So what should she do? She should desert, and the male will get 3 future offspring. Okay. Now, if the male deserts, then if the female cares, she'll get 4, but if she deserts, she'll get 3. So the female should care if the male deserts, and the male will get 5. So, what does the male do? He goes for the 5 rather than the 3. So this is the path you expect. You expect male desertion and female care. Okay. Incidentally, in this model, if both the male and the female decided to care together, they would do better. They would both do better. But that doesn't evolve. It won't evolve. Because you start coming down this tree, you get to here, and rather the male cares, but then the female, she'll get 7 if she deserts rather than caring, so she'll desert. You're not going to end up there. Okay. So that's one of the first things in game theory, when there's these frequency-dependent effects. Where you end up is not necessarily good for the individuals themselves. Not necessarily the best, if they could in some way cooperate. Okay, so here's the thing I've just looked at. Let's have a look at another example of such a tree. This tree is exactly the same as before, except I've changed this 4 here to a 2. So the payoff to the female has been reduced in one particular circumstance. So let's follow the logic. Now, if the male cares, the female will desert, and the male will get 3. Fine. If the male deserts, the female does better by deserting, which is 3, than 2, which is if she cares. So the female will desert. The female actually will desert whatever the male does now. So the male does better to care. So the tree now looks like this. So by altering these payoffs, I've gone from the male desertion and female care to male care and female desertion. But the important thing is if you look at the payoffs to the female is now getting 7 in this tree, whereas she got 4 in this tree. So by reducing her payoff, she can do better. Okay. She's handicapping herself. And by handicapping herself, she is actually doing better. Okay. Now, it's not clear to what extent birds do this, but for example, there are instances where females seem to lay bigger clutch sizes, then they can look after themselves. And that forces the male to care rather than to desert and so on. Okay. But anyway, this example is to show you that once you get into these interactions of individuals, the whole flavor of looking at optimal strategies, if you like, completely changes. Well, I haven't got much. Yeah, the female increases her payoff by handicapping herself. So, what I've tried to do in this talk is, especially focusing on the singing versus foraging model, it's a schematic model. It establishes general results which are typically applicable to many species, but don't apply in detail to any species, because whenever you go to a particular species, there are all sorts of complications which go on, which are local to that species. Okay? You have to realize that. So, but I still think, if you like, the fact that pointing out that strategic regulation of energy reserves is an important factor is worth doing. Yeah, and it certainly motivated experiments, which led to new knowledge, in fact, and it, if you like, help us to expose the logic of what's going on. Anyway, thank you. That's all I've got to say, Tom.
that was a very interesting talk, and I wonder how many of us reflected on that evolutionary decision tree game theory with our offspring, whether we should have defected or stayed. But that's for another day. We now get to the Q&A session. So John has got about just under half an hour or so to answer questions. We always start in the room, but online, we haven't got any questions online yet. So for the online audience, please get your thinking hats on, and we come to you in just a moment. Who would like to go first in the room? This lady.
It's a very simple question. It's a very simple question. What's the most complex thing you've modelled, and what was the most surprising result?
It's interesting doing complex models, because the more complex you make the models, the more difficult to understand what's going on in that model. Okay. And that, to me, is quite dangerous, because you can see I put in lots of parameters in these models, for example, and make lots of assumptions, and you worry about those assumptions. To what extent do they reflect the biology? And so if you make a really complex model where you can't really understand what's going on, then how can you have, if you like, any confidence in the predictions of those models? That's typically what I try and do, yes. Yes. So, if you like, this is a model zero that I presented here. So, we did go on to make more complicated models. For example, where they can sing at night, but also where you evolve the female preference for males, and where the males differed in their quality, and high quality males are better getting food, and then the female wants to choose males which are good at getting food, but all she knows is when the males are singing and how often they're singing. So you're co-evolving the female strategy and the male strategy. So that was a fairly complicated model, if you like. Some of the other models, the annual routine models of multi-migration, they're certainly things where everything depends on everything else. And I mean, one referee actually said to me, you know, I can't accept a model with 28 parameters or whatever it is. And my argument was this model was as simple as possible to capture the annual routine, in fact. Yeah, I wouldn't like to go beyond that in some sense, because again, it's this question of trying to understand. This thing we've just seen, by the way, surprising results. I made a model of negotiation between parents over care of their young. And it's a strange model because it predicts that they aren't very cooperative at all. And that sort of surprised me in a way. But again, it's not necessarily a definitive model. It's an interesting problem. If you have two parents which are, each of them can choose not whether to care or desert, but it's biparental care, so they're both caring. And then how much effort should they put in? And there are costs of effort, because if you're thinking of a small bird, then they go out to get food, they wear themselves out, they expose themselves to predators, etc. So each of them wants the other to put in the effort. And so you can look at a model where, again, biologists had made this simple model, which predicted that the efforts of each was the best given the other. The effort of a male was the best given that of a female, and vice versa. That sounded sensible to biologists, but it's a load of rubbish. And it's a load of rubbish because it essentially assumes that efforts are fixed, and efforts really aren't fixed. Females adjust their efforts to the male's effort, and vice versa. So what you should be evolving is not efforts, but the rules for choosing efforts as a function of what your partner's doing. And that was a complicated model too, anyway.
Okay, any more questions in the room? I don't think we've got any questions online yet.
I just wonder where you got the runs from for the evolutionary gains. Are they arbitrary? Or?
The payouts I wrote down. Yeah. I mean, The actual numbers I wrote down are fairly arbitrary. They're not arbitrary. They're specifically chosen to make a logical point. Let me put it like that. So in any given circumstances, you'd have to think of what are the payoffs in this particular case. But you know, my objective was to expose the logic again, to show you the possibilities and to make people aware of the possibilities. Yeah.
You've spoken about models used in biology. Have you applied these techniques in other areas?
Well, I don't typically, but it's interesting that when Don originally emailed me, he said, I did a master's in operations research in Cornell in the 1960s sometime, yeah. And it was clear that Don was introduced to techniques which are actually rather similar to what I use. So there's a period of operations research. Economists use things like this. Yes, I mean, anything where one is trying to look at a system and trying to, if you like, optimize the performance of the system. Yeah. You got anything to add to that?
Yes, I think that's true. The operational research is essentially mathematically trying to optimize the microphone. Operational research is trying to mathematically optimize situations in business or in military situations or something by studying the parameters and working out which choice will actually give the optimum outcome. And this, unsurprisingly, is very similar to the problem that natural selection is solving. So it's quite reasonable that we're looking at the same ideas.
Sure. Yeah. There's a lot in common with the techniques of game theory. I mentioned economists use that all the time. And in fact, to me, it probably is more likely to give realistic predictions in biology than in economics, because sometimes the economic models are just a bit too simple. You know. But, yeah.
Okay, we've got quite a few more questions here now in the room, but we've also got some online. So okay. 2 more questions in the room and then I go online.
Hi, John. You were talking about the interesting problem of the uniformity of the environment when you were talking about foraging strategies. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you made the point that really everything depends on what the animal expects to be putting elsewhere. Mm-hmm. And I'm sort of assuming that when you make these models, you have to assume that the environment is indeed uniform.
You have to, I wouldn't say it's uniform, you have to assume that if you're thinking about evolution producing a solution somewhere, then the environment can't have changed radically over time. So you're assuming, I wouldn't call it a uniformness, it's a stationarity. So for example, the food is stochastic, but yes, the way in which it fluctuates has remained fixed over years.
So there's a difference between an animal assuming the probability of what things are like elsewhere, and actually there being systematic variation in the environment.
So there can be, are you talking about, I mean, an environment where there are uncertainties and fluctuations, or are you talking about the environment actually changing?
There's that too, but there's also the issue of, if you like, unknown geographic variation.
Sure.
And I guess what I'm getting at here is I'm wondering if there are some situations which are not only too complicated for you to model,
Yeah.
but actually too complicated for the animal to have an internal model too.
Yeah, yes, I mean, the thing about the rules is that you expect rules to evolve which behave quite well in a natural environment which is stable over time. But quite well doesn't mean really optimal. And they can perform very badly in certain circumstances. I mean, classic example is you give some birds, they prefer large eggs. And if you give them a super large egg, they prefer that because there's been no selection against that in the past, etc. So they can do stupid things. They have rules which are perform reasonably well in their natural environments. Sure. But are not universally optimal. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We've got one more question in the room and then we go online.
Right, thank you. Fascinating talk. Thank you very much indeed. I'm a psychiatrist and I've often wondered how to understand human behaviour. It's just 50 years since I was first appointed a consultant psychiatrist. I think I know less about psychiatry now than I did when I was younger. But presumably by the time I'm dead, I'll know nothing at all. And I think I come to the point that is trying to explain the best way I can. Human behaviours have some really peculiar and what would appear to be very deleterious effects on their reproductive success.
Sure.
Feel that these were not very helpful.
Yeah.
I think about major depression, things like that.
Sure.
But these illnesses persist. Why is it on the basis of your theories or your projections?
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts about that?
I'm not sure.
That might help me in my confusion.
Sure, I'm not sure is the answer. The first thing to say is I don't work on humans because modelling them is a whole can of worms in a way. The problem is, as Don actually said, was that if I'm thinking, even birds have to some extent cultural inheritance, a little bit song and so on is inherited, it can be. But mostly, you're thinking, if you like, in instinctive terms, but it's not just instinct. Their behaviours aren't fixed. They have flexible strategies which respond to changing circumstances, etc. But with humans, it's complicated by culture, and that our strategies are extraordinarily complex. So. And depend on culture. So when you see behaviour, you're an awful long way from the genes, is the problem. So it makes it very difficult, it seems to me, and as I said, a whole can of worms to try. And you get lots of people who make just so stories about, why humans are doing what they're doing, but it's very dangerous. Or it can be dubious. Let me modify it. As for humans, yes, I don't know is the answer. It is this thing about, I'm dealing with optimal strategies here, but in very complicated situations, it comes back to, I think, to your point, that in very complicated situations, you don't expect optimal strategies to evolve. What you expect is relatively simple mechanisms which perform well on average. Now, that means that those mechanisms can, if you like, perform badly in certain circumstances. Now, the thing with depression, the difficulty of thinking about it is it's relatively common, and you would think, therefore, that it would be selected against. But whether it is to do with the current environment, do you think over human history there's always been depression? In hunter-gatherer societies, there's depression as well, and so on.
I think it might have been particularly helpful in hunter-gatherer societies.
So you're saying something where it sounds like you're saying it could be adaptive. Is that what you're saying or not?
Yes, that's my just so story.
Yes, okay. Why would it be adaptive? Can I ask you
I
that?
think it's out of starvation. In fact, some of the members of the tribe
Yeah,
were eating a lot less, particularly the female members of the tribe,
yeah,
eating less but surviving until
yeah,
the times came around, so they were able to reproduce again, might have been
yeah.
a survival strategy
Right.
for
Right.
the whole of the tribe, the whole genotype rather than the genotype of
Yeah.
individuals.
Yeah, yeah, okay. Do you think there could be an element also of manipulating others within your local group, because these hunter-gatherer societies are they're kin-related, etc., typically. So do you think that, the last game theory example I showed, sometimes the best thing to do is to lower your payoff and you can get an advantage. Do you think there could be something of that sort going on?
I think there must be very much so.
Yeah.
More interesting questions are one, something as damaging as schizophrenia is.
Yeah.
There's a relatively high percentage, maybe 1% of the total population.
Yeah.
I found that much more difficult to understand.
Now you need to stop asking questions, John. You're supposed to be answering. Right. Just an online observation rather than a question, and that's from Robert. Arguably, science is ultimately about predicting events in the world. Currently, one has to understand in human terms what is happening so scientists knows what to ask next. However, if you let computers evolve models themselves, the models can be developed which maximize prediction without needing any human interaction. Question mark.
I'm not quite sure what's going on here, I have to say. Could you say that again?
I can read it again, but I'm not sure it will elucidate the thing. I think, paraphrasing, I think if computers could actually model things themselves with only initial programming by individual humans, and then continue that program and develop their own programs for predictions, then there's no future requirement to have human interactions in the modeling at all.
Well, we're not at that stage at the moment. When you construct a model, as I said, it's an art in some ways in putting the right things in, and that depends a lot on your judgment, and I don't actually think computers are going to help you very much in that. However, I believe that eventually we will develop intelligent computers, and then he might be right,
Yeah, I mean, this might be, I don't know whether Robert meant that, but I mean, it may have something to do with things like AI potentially helping to solve problems,
Sure.
protein folding problems.
Yeah, sure.
So it may have been something to do with that. Okay, anybody else in the room? There's a gentleman at the back.
Just following on from the last question, how do you differentiate between things acting in their own best interest and population groups acting in the best interest of a population? Because sometimes I assume those are not the same thing.
Sure, definitely. So there's quite a debate about, if you like, what one call the levels of selection, which is to what extent are things that the good of the population, if you like, selected for as opposed to individuals. And by and large, it seems that you should be thinking at the individual level, but it's complicated by the fact that in many populations, we're thinking about hunter-gatherer societies, for example, a lot of the population is close kin. And ultimately, it's about the spread of genes. And if you've got close kin, they share genes. So, therefore, you don't expect individual optimization in that sense. You expect what is technically termed kin selection, in that you maximize something which propagates, if you like, the spread of the genes which cause the behavior, but you share those with kin, and so you will help them. So a lot of the modern way of thinking about it is probably most of those effects can be thought of in those terms. But you're quite right that we do need to think about individuals versus populations. But I think most people at the moment think that the kin selection is the most important element there. I mean, you know this classic quote, especially by Haldane, that, I'll sacrifice myself, what is it, 2 brothers or 8 cousins or whatever it is. That's right, yes, sure, yeah.
Good. Any more questions?
Can I also say something else? There's some interesting problems which, again, show you should be at the gene level. And right at the beginning, I alluded to the fact that measuring fitness is simple in many cases when it's just the number of offspring produced over the lifetime. But there are cases when that isn't the case. And, for example, if you're thinking like an annual plant, then a desert plant, let's say, and the plant grows in a year and then produces seeds, and the seeds go into the ground, and the parent plant dies, and the next year the seeds can germinate, or they can remain dormant for at least 1 more year. Now, under those circumstances, if environmental conditions vary, and the seed grows in a bad year, it may be all seeds which grow in a bad year die. So, if the seed is maximizing the probability or the mean number of descendants it will leave in the next generation, it should grow. But that won't evolve because a genotype which codes for that will be wiped out the moment a bad year occurs. So instead, the prediction is that you should get some seeds germinating now and some remaining dormant as an insurance against it being a bad year. So if you think about it from those terms, it's not about the individual at all. It's about the genotype and the spread of a particular gene. So there's a particular case when one isn't thinking at the individual level.
Okay, it's coming up to 9:15. Are there any more questions in the room there? None online. If there's no final burning questions, we'll draw it to a conclusion. And can you please join me in thanking John for a fantastic talk tonight. Thank you very much. John,